Thank you. Thank you, Jake. Good morning. I always like to look about an audience to see if I can find friendly faces. And I admit this morning that I was checking to see if my son made it. I haven't found him yet. I am particularly happy to be here this morning, mainly for a selfish reason. Having never attended college, I welcome any opportunity to get even a second-hand look at secondary education. I particularly like to talk with young people, not only because I am the father of 5 children, but because I have a basic interest in young people, and not just those who play football or basketball or baseball or whatever. Since first being invited to speak this morning to you, I have tossed around in my mind a number of questions. For those of you in our audience who have ever been called upon to speak, I know you know what I'm talking about. What is expected of me? What could I, a sports broadcaster of over 30 years' experience, have to say that a group of young people attending Augsburg College be interested in? How could these two worlds possibly meet so that it would be of interest to you? I have reached some conclusions, and I hope that you agree with them when our session this morning has ended. I was asked for a title. I had to grasp for one. And I labeled my remarks this morning, "Some Win, Some Lose." Anytime I have been in the capacity of a listener, as you are this morning, inevitably I would disagree with something the speaker had said, would wonder why he or she did not touch on some particular subject that I would like to have heard them speak on. And I always welcomed an opportunity to question a speaker, which is by way of establishing the ground rules for this morning. At the conclusion of my remarks, there will be an opportunity for those who have the time and the inclination to stick around, and we'll have a brief little forum. For a great number of years, I have been fascinated in analyzing why some teams win and some teams lose. And on an individual basis, I have been fascinated as I have watched individuals perform. Why the 6'2", 195-pound, fantastic physical specimen who could run the 100 in 9-point-something never really succeeded in reaching his, quote, potential. And why a 5'9", 175-pound physical specimen who would run the 100 in an embarrassing length of time would somehow reach heights that his physical attributes would suggest he would never even come close to. I would like to tell you of 2 young men, one in baseball and one in football. And I would like to talk of several teams I've been associated with. And somewhere in here, I hope that you might find a key to an answer to why some win and why some lose. Along the line, I would like to pass along the philosophy of one of the great men I've ever known in American sports. I would not only like to pass it along, but I would very strongly urge that you consider it as a philosophy of your own. The philosophy that I suggest would be of value whether you have ever played or hope to play in any sport and are interested in any sport or not. I still think it's a philosophy that has a place with everyone of any age. Now to my two young men. Their names really are unimportant. I'll tell you their names a bit later. But I suggest that what they have done is slightly important. About 15 years ago, a very remarkable man, now deceased, a very remarkable man, was then general manager of the Pittsburgh Pirates. His name was Branch Rickey Sr., one of the most persuasive and eloquent men I have ever known. In those days, the Pirates had a terrible baseball team. I was not their broadcaster, I should add. I was broadcasting daily sports shows at that time in Pittsburgh, and as such, I would cover a news conference, which I'm about to describe. Mr. Rickey had a very unique way of capturing your attention. He would turn away from you at times, and he had a great vocabulary. And he said, "We have just signed a young man out of college who can someday play on a pennant winner." Well, now, to mention the Pirates and the pennant in those years was utterly ridiculous. The Pirates in those days and other major league teams played only 154 games a year. On sheer merit, they had just managed to lose 114 in the preceding season. That takes quite a bit of doing. So Mr. Rickey said, "We have just signed a young man off a college campus who can play on a pennant winner," and then he described him. He said, "He's not particularly fast." He said, "Although he's an infielder, his arm is just average." And he never called a man a batter. He called him a batsman. He said, "Although he's a right-handed batsman, he has no power to left field." Well, at this moment, some of us in the press conference figured that he was pulling our leg. But then he added, "But I repeat, gentlemen, this young man can play on a pennant winner." That's the way he talked. And he again took his cigar out of his mouth and looked around, and everybody sort of laughed him off, and we went about our business. Let me tell you what this young man did. He never played a game of minor league baseball. He came to the majors immediately. And although it was a bad Pirate team the following year, he led that team in batting. A few years later, 1960 to be precise, he played on a pennant winner with the Pirates. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they also won the World Series. They played the Yankees in what was to all of us from Pittsburgh a memorable World Series, and they won it in 7 games. He was traded several years later to the St. Louis Cardinals, and I don't think it's quite a coincidence that the Cardinals won the pennant. Keep in mind the original description of him. He worked at getting rid of a ball faster than most any infielder I've ever watched, because he had an average arm, but he got it there. He was outstanding in basketball, and although he had no speed, he had the first 2 or 3 quick steps that the good basketball player has. And so he looked as if he covered an awful lot of ground. He studied hitters and their tendencies, and he inevitably was at the right place. And he had no power to left field. And so he worked until his hands were blistered at becoming, even by the admission of old-timers like Pie Traynor, for example, he worked at becoming one of the great hit-and-run men of the last several decades in professional baseball. He became expert at hitting behind the runner. And he was not a fast base runner, but he studied pitchers and their moves, and he studied outfielders and their arms until he became an intelligent base runner. And he had one of the most intense, fantastic desires to win and excel of anyone I have ever known. For those of you who have followed baseball fanatically, you probably know I've been talking about Dick Groat, who just announced his retirement from baseball. Most valuable player, batting championship, 2 pennant winners, 2 World Series rings. He's achieved about every goal that any young man would ever want to achieve who had ever played baseball. If you were a major league scout today and went out on your diamond here and were told to pick out the most likely prospect, and if the Dick Groat of 1967 were out there, I don't think you'd give him a nickel in the way of a bonus, and you might not even give him a second look as a player, unless there'd be some fantastic device that they would come up with that would scout desire. And I've never yet seen that device. When the 6'2" phenoms with the strong arms and the great power and the blazing speed, when I have long forgotten the hundreds of that type I have known in baseball, I'll remember Dick Groat. Even prior to the time I have told you about now, when most of you were quite young, prior to a time when many of you were born, there was a player in the National Football League who was 5'9" and 175. He was an All-American, which sometimes means something and sometimes doesn't. He was an All-American at a Southern school. And he came to the pro leagues, and in those days he played with a team that still used the single wing type of offense. Now, this doesn't mean anything to you, and the only reason I mention it is that he was the tailback or left halfback. He was the key man in that offense. They didn't use a man under the center like the T quarterback that you see today. And he took a brutal physical beating. He was so slow that around Pittsburgh they kidded they should put more blockers behind him than in front of him so he wouldn't get caught. He was slow. He had the most ridiculous passing style I've ever seen. Wobbly passes, but he completed a great majority of them. His punting style was absolutely nothing, but he was a great punter. He place kicked like no man I've ever seen. He had a pendulum style. I can't show you here. In the first place, I can't kick, but he didn't even take a step. He just stepped to the ball and just kicked like that. Amazingly accurate. On third and short yardage, you knew inevitably, almost inevitably, that he'd get the ball, and almost inevitably, it seemed, he'd get the first down. And on third and long yardage, you knew he was going to throw, and he'd complete that wobbly, ridiculous-looking pass. And keeping in mind today's professional football game, he 1 year averaged 55 minutes a game. He played both ways. Mind you now, 5'9", 175, and slow. He's in football's Hall of Fame. He was All-Pro a number of years. Rookie of the Year, Sophomore of the Year, you name it. And I'll tell you the same thing of him that I said of Dick Groat. If you went out today, if you were a scout for the Minnesota Vikings or the Green Bay Packers, you name it, you wouldn't look at him twice. And the funny thing, you know how slow he was? His nickname was Bullet Bill. Bullet Bill Dudley. You never heard of him. You know something? When I have forgotten some 6'3", 220-pound speedsters who came into the pro league with the tag, he can't miss, with his potential, and then you fill in all the rest of it. When I've forgotten hundreds of those, I'll remember Bullet Bill. What a player. What a player. I'd like to talk to you about a team. People who've been close to me these last few years have gotten tired of me talking about a team. One team in particular. The Green Bay Packers. An amazing organization. Even for those of us on the fringe who get a chance to peek in and try to figure out what makes them tick. Why do they win? What does Vince Lombardi really like? These things I like to talk about. I'd like to talk first a little bit about this team and why I think they win. They have some good players. You can believe that. Now, there are those in football, knowledgeable, who insist that there are teams in the National Football League with better overall personnel. But somehow they don't win. Not that it's all important that you must win, that you should not lose, not at all. I'll get to that in a moment. The Packers have the greatest pride of any team I've ever known. To me, they are living proof, in a day of doubters in some old-fashioned words and virtues, they are living proof that there are a few things that are never going to be old-fashioned. And some of your age and mine refer to these words as corny. Dedication, desire, sacrifice, preparation. This team has it in abundance. Some examples. Last year, Paul Hornung's contributions on the field were very limited. He was hurt. He'll never play again. He was the unofficial coach of a young man by the name of Donnie Anderson, one of the more highly publicized and highly paid young men in America. Before every game, Hornung, to the young man who was taking his job, watch this, watch that, this linebacker does this, and I want you. He became an unofficial coach when he couldn't contribute as a player. When Elijah Pitts, a fine halfback, came to the Packers as a lonely and completely bewildered young man out of an unknown college in Arkansas, Philander Smith. Ever heard of it? Elijah Pitts, halfback. And they said to Coach Lombardi, "Why did you keep him?" And the coach says, "Wait and see." The first veteran to make him welcome, to let him know that he wanted him, was the guy whose job Pitts was trying to take, Hornung. Ask Fuzzy Thurston, one of the great veteran offensive linemen in the National Football League and one of the wits on our club, one of the guys that keeps the team loose. Ask him, how good can Gail Gillingham be? Gail played at the University of Minnesota. And Fuzzy's eyes light up that he says the best. You know who Gillingham's unofficial coach is? Thurston. Thurston's on the bench today, and Gillingham is playing, and he's going to be one of the greatest, probably one of the greatest ever played the game at his position. Multiply those examples by many more, and you have a team with the greatest cohesiveness and desire of any team I've ever known. You know, one of the first things that Coach Lombardi tells a Packer when the final cut has been made, and in effect, this is now the group. These are the 40 who are going to play for Green Bay this year. You know what he tells them? He tells every first-year player, there are 3 things that are now important to you, and don't ever forget what I'm going to tell you. Your family, your religion, and the Packers. Now, among some critics, there are a few doubts as to which he places first, but I assure you that is the order. Now, it's not so important that Vince Lombardi believes this, and he does. But to me, the interesting thing is that he is able to convince 40 reasonably intelligent, and in some cases highly intelligent, young men, some of whom are mature men of 34 and 35, that he convinces them that these things are important. Who starts for the Green Bay Packers? This was a big question at one position before last year's National Football League championship game, Green Bay and Dallas in Dallas. Great game. If you like football, boy, this was, to me, one of the memorable games I've ever seen or had a chance to televise. And the sports writers were asking, will it be Pitts or will it be Hornung? Will Lombardi turn emotional and will he start the veteran Hornung who's about finished, or will he start Pitts? And a writer several days before the game in the Cotton Bowl, within my hearing, followed the coach around. He didn't know Lombardi very well, and he didn't know you don't badger this man about something. He said, who's it going to be, Coach? Pitts or Hornung? Lombardi over his shoulder said, I don't know. Ah, come on, Coach. You know who's going to... I don't know. And then he made a bad mistake. He asked him a third time. And Lombardi turned on him. He says, you are rather stupid. He said, you not only don't understand me when I tell you something, but you don't understand something about this team. And so you don't make the same mistake again. Let's get one thing straight. On this team, it doesn't make any difference who starts. And the man walked away, and I don't think he will forget it. When that game was over, won by the Packers in a thrilling finish, in the dressing room, some writers asked of Coach Lombardi, why do the Packers win? And if you forget everything else that I mentioned to you this morning, I wish you would remember this. Among other things, in a football parlance that he said that day, the one thing that remains with me, and I can't think of any man in American sports, prominent in American sports, who could make this statement and not be laughed at or ridiculed or doubted or whatever. But his answer was this. He said, on this team, there is great love. And he is so sincere and so obviously sincere that nobody laughed or ridiculed him, but they believed it. His basic philosophy of football, I wish somehow I could adopt. I wish somehow you and your counterpart, wherever, could adopt. And you know what it is? He says this. Everybody has certain abilities, and we're created in such a way that they differ and they vary. But he says that if you, and you can put in a parenthesis here, whatever your goal, whatever your profession, whatever studies, whatever anything, he says, if this is your level of ability, if you perform any less than that, you cheat yourself and you cheat your God. He's an amazing man with an amazing philosophy. What's he really like? He's autocratic, he's cynical, he's dictatorial. He's the most thorough man I've ever known. He's fair, to my knowledge. Now, not quite the way Henry Jordan, one of our great players, describes him. Henry Jordan says, you're right, Lombardi is fair. He treats us all alike, like dogs. Not quite that way. And Henry Jordan will say, is he convincing? Well, he said, I don't really know, except that when he tells me to sit down, I don't even look for a chair. Would he be successful in any other business? At a high school banquet in Wisconsin last winter, a bunch of us at the head table were talking, as inevitably people do in Wisconsin, about the Packers, and the subject got around to Lombardi, and it got into one of those silly little talk games. Would he be successful at? And then everybody would fill in. One man said, well, I think he'd be a great superintendent of a steel mill. And somebody else said, well, I think he'd be so-and-so and so-and-so. And there's a little parish priest who waited till everybody had had their say. And he turned over to me, he says, you finished? And I said, yes, why? He says, I shudder at the thought, but what a bishop. And he would be. He would be. Having absolutely nothing to do with football or anything that even remotely connected with what I've mentioned so far, but so that I can conclude my informal remarks, hopefully on a light vein and in view of the weather outside, so that we can all be transported to a nicer type of weather and sport that would fit in with that weather. I must tell you a story. I must tell you a story. It has to do with golf, which is not exactly in season right now. And I'll leave it up to you as to whether it is true or could be true or not. Since I've just mentioned the priest, this has to do with a Catholic priest and a very Lutheran caddy. And the priest was a pretty good golfer. And the caddy was a very discerning caddy and a good golfer in his own right. And the priest walked up to his ball on the fairway, and he looked at the green, and he looked at his caddy, and he says, "What do you think, young man?" The caddy, very polite, said, "Well, Father, I think about a 3-iron. And the father said, "Well, son, I just think we'll use a 4-iron and perhaps a little bit of prayer." And the caddy just shrugged his shoulders. And the priest, if you play golf, you will appreciate the fact that the priest swung mightily and knocked the ball a ridiculously short distance, like about maybe 30 yards. And not a word was said. They walked up to the ball, and the priest looked at the caddy, and he said, "What do you think now, son?" And he said, "Well, Father, if you don't mind my saying so, when we Lutherans pray, we keep our head down." In some 30 years of broadcasting, I have met many amazing people, many interesting people, and have been blessed in having some remarkable experiences. And I have tried through these years to figure out an answer to why some win and some lose. And I guess there is no one answer, certainly no pat answer, any more than right now I could talk to any one of you or various groups made up of you and figure out whether you're going to succeed or you won't succeed. But I do hope that if through me I can transmit anything that I've learned in these years of being around sports and people in sports, I would hope that I could transmit this lesson that I think I have learned. And that is that the so-called old-fashioned virtues are really not old-fashioned at all, and they're still worthwhile. And you'll get buffeted about a bit if you stand up to defend them. But somehow I think that you might enjoy living in this great world of ours a little bit more if you do stand up and defend it. I believe it's worthwhile. For those of you who would care to stay, I'd be most happy to exchange views on a great variety of subjects. Thank you very kindly.